Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Leverage Your Podcast show. And I have with me, there's so many things I could say about you, Mike. Honestly, you've been in the industry for as if not longer than I have, with the social media hat. You're now with Agorapulse as well, and head of strategic partnerships. And you just told me that you host 6 podcasts. I just about passed out. So, Mike Alton, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's been a long time since our
I
first
know.
episode together, so this is really fun, a little nostalgic for me.
Agreed. We're talking like 8 years, or like it's 6 years for it's a long time. That's all I know. But I still get your emails and I still look at them. I still see you out there. So it's great that we're still connected. And
Absolutely.
both in
Thanks
the
for having
podcast
me.
space.
Right? Which I would not have said on that first podcast with you
No,
8, 10 years ago. I would have said, no, I don't want to host my own
no,
podcast. Never, never, never.
me neither.
Things
It
have
scared the
changed.
crap out of me. Yeah, I was like, forget it. But now I love it. So okay, we have to start here. How are you the host of 6 podcasts? That's just insane.
It is, and it's not something I would have ever dreamed or planned. So last year, I relaunched a show that I had started a couple years ago called Partnership Unpacked, because that was really my focus at Agorapulse. And I wanted a way to connect with partnership experts in that industry and, frankly, selfishly learn from them. So I was
Mm,
literally picking their brains on the show. And I did that all last year, 50 episodes into it. Coming into this year, I was going to keep doing that. And then in the middle of the first quarter, or early in the first quarter, my boss, the CEO of Agorapulse, came to me and says, "Hey, I have this idea. That you should all be scared when the CEO comes to you with an idea and
uh-huh.
there's nobody in between to buffer that, because then it means it's got to be done." Nobody was all fine. He comes to me and says, "I'd like you to start 3 new podcasts, one for agencies, one for retail, and one for hospitality." We can get into what those were and why. But I had also started a new weekly show like the month before called the Martech Show, which was designed to bring on partners and share their solution with our audience. That's the best way to put it. And of course, use it for lead gen. So these were going to be webinars that were going to power a podcast down the road. So we had the
Mm,
Partnership Unpacked podcast, the Martech Show, and now 3 new podcasts. So I did put Partnership Unpacked on hold while I was launching all these other podcasts. We kind of
yeah.
wanted to do them quickly. And then, so that's 5. And the sixth one is my own little baby that I just launched, AI in Marketing Unpacked. That's got 5 or 6 episodes in already.
That's amazing. So how do you have time to run your business and do work?
Fortunately, this is the focus of my job now. These
Yeah.
these main shows, these Agorapulse shows, um, and because I'm not doing them all on my own, we have a team. So I have a content editor that's taking care of the blog post publishing. We have a video team that's creating the video snippets out of the finished product. We have a design team that's creating the graphics. We had a web dev team that helped me build the pages. I had to touch very little of those things. And
Yeah.
having done this now several times, Partnership Unpacked was not my first show. I was able to give them a lot of direction and just say,
Yeah.
here, this is what I need. I need these graphics. I need these frames, these templates, whatever the case might be. And I brought on a VA, and I was really lucky. I found this guy on Fiverr from Nigeria who had podcast publishing and monitoring and everything experience.
Wow.
So I was able to get somebody really affordable who also knows what he's doing. It's shocking.
Right?
But I don't have to teach him Descript. I don't have to teach him
Sweet.
the web, the podcast platform. I only had to tell them, here's the process I'd like you to follow.
Yeah.
And we have an Asana task. And again, we've got a project manager that sets up Asana for me. So my job then is to focus on finding the guests, vetting the
Yeah.
guests, and conducting the interviews. And that's still time consuming,
Yeah.
which we might get into some of the shortcuts there, but that's my focus. So that's all
Yeah.
I'm able to do.
That's
So many
awesome.
shows at once,
I'd love to do that all day long.
right?
That would be so fun. Thanks for the sneak peek and behind the scenes. I'm a processes person, so I love that part of like how people do what behind the scenes and all that good stuff. And honestly, you can't host a podcast without having some kind of support in the back end.
Yeah.
So yeah, so glad that you have a good team behind you.
Yeah. You can't do it well. You can do it.
No. Good
But
point.
you're going to drop things, and you're not going to be able to
Yeah.
follow through the way that you need to. Like this today, we dropped. It's a Tuesday, so this is every single Tuesday we drop our agency focused podcast, which means as soon as that's published, I need to send an email to the
Mhm.
guest, thanking them for being on the show, linking to the blog post, linking to the Google Drive folder where we put all their assets and snippets and all these things that we've created. They need to know that that's there.
Yeah,
That's the kind of detail, though. Honestly, a lot of podcast hosts miss that detail
I
because they're
know.
doing it all themselves, and that's an easy one to drop.
It is. It kind of goes to the bottom of the pile of things to do. And honestly, that will give you the biggest fruit for your labor, so to speak. So we are talking about podcast hosts today, but why I brought you on this show is something that you said that really piqued my interest. And we all think about, audience focused podcast, but you were talking about zero listens podcast. And that seems to be like, what? Like totally against the grain. So what is wrong with audience focused podcast and how would you describe zero listens podcast?
Well, I'd say there's nothing wrong with an audience focused
Yeah,
podcast,
fair enough.
except it's really hard to be successful at an audience focused podcast if you're not in the entertainment side of podcasting. If you're B2B, and this is a business focused podcast, it's really hard to feel successful
Yeah.
when you only get 75, 100, 125 downloads per episode. You're like, I can post to Twitter and get that many views, and that took me 5 seconds. And yes, that's true. It's not the same. You're not in their
No.
ears on a tweet, but it's still, as marketers, it's hard for us to ignore those top level metrics. And so I need to give full credit to A. Lee Judge at Content Monster, because this was his term. I'd never heard Zero Listens podcast before, ever, or Zero Listens
Mm-mm.
strategy, until I'm on his email list, and I started to see some of his content talking about this. He does a whole series of videos that really go into depth, how to
Mm.
set it up, what it is, and so on. But it's this idea that as a business, our focus is less on trying to count the number of people who are listening to the content
Yeah.
and more about the individuals that we're putting in the seats, the people that we're actually talking to in the studio, right? Like if this is my podcast and I'm hosting, Lindsay, you're my guest, you're the actual target
Yeah.
for my content. You're the one that I want to build a relationship with, maybe as a partner, maybe as a customer. It kind of depends on your business goals. But the idea is, I want that relationship with you. And to take it a step further, you can take that podcast content and use it to fuel your sales team in their outbound endeavors, so they can be using that content to outreach to, in my case, agency owners. Agorapulse is
Mm.
very focused on helping marketing agencies. So our sales team is taking my podcasts and using them in their introductory messaging to prospective agencies. Hey, I saw you were talking about this on LinkedIn. Our guy Mike, he just did this episode about, the struggles that agencies have with when they've got multiple partners and they're not aligned. And you were talking about that. I thought you might find this interesting. Super, super subtle,
Very.
very, very low touch, not high pressure sales kind of a thing. The kind of thing that any sales rep would want to use
Yeah.
to build a relationship with their target prospect. Now, we're talking about prospects at a certain level, right? This is not something you would do for a one-time $20 ebook or widget
Totally.
sale. You're looking for prospects that have a certain level of MRR, whatever that is, monthly recurring revenue for your business. But once you identify that, and you identify the actual prospects that you're trying to get in front of, now you've got this two-pronged approach where you've got someone like me who's developing relationships and opening relationships with those prospects
Hmm.
by inviting them to be on the podcast, and having that nice conversation, that nice time on the podcast. And then you've got the sales team who's then following up and using a lot of that material in other ways with other prospects.
Yeah. And I love that approach. And no one talks about it. And people just have this one track mind when it comes to having a podcast, that it's all about, downloads. Say you can even flip the script and just say, even being strategic about what shows you guest on, not just to get leads, and not downloads, but leads from the show that you guest on, and looking at the audience. It's like really looking into that relationship that you have with that host and how that can move your business forward. It's so smart.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I know. I love it. And to have a name for it, I'm like, yes. And just to hear someone else talking about it, honestly, I think that's really smart. So, how would you then say to strategically choose the guests that you would want on your show if you are taking a zero listens approach?
Definitely be thinking about, who are you bringing on? What's the value that they're going to be able to add to the content that you're generating in the end? Because you do want to have some purpose for that, like I said,
Mhm.
whether it's sales outreach or something else. But then, yeah, you're looking for, what opportunity am I going to create by bringing them onto my show? Is it a target prospect? Is it somebody that I really truly want to sell to? That's not the case with every single guest that I bring on my podcast at Agorapulse, but it's the case with a lot of them,
Yeah.
right? We've got lists of social media managers for the kinds of businesses that we would love to work with that we aren't currently working with, that probably have never heard of us, to be perfectly frank. And so I'm reaching out to these people on LinkedIn, cold but personalized, and saying, hey, looks like you're doing some great work in the social media marketing space. I'd love to bring you on the podcast and let you talk about the work that you're doing. They don't all do it, but a lot of them
Mm.
see that and they're flattered by the invitation. They should be. They are doing
Yeah.
great work. I mean, if they're doing social media marketing for a recognizable brand, well, kudos to them. A friend of mine recently got hired as a social media manager for Lego, and we're like, dude, you've made it. That's
That's
awesome.
cool.
What a fun job. And in fact, just this week, he masterminded this fantastic post to social media where they had a Lego cat on a keyboard, and it was and the tweet that went with the image was just gobbledygook, as though it was the cat had walked on the keyboard and posted the tweet. I mean, it was just brilliant, and it was so on brand. So those are the kinds of people that we want to talk to and bring on the show and have really good in-depth conversations about what is life like, where they're at in their journey, where they're at professionally, what are some of the challenges that they've worked through. On a lot of the podcasts, particularly on the agency side, we've been talking a lot about the pandemic, and most people are familiar with the impact that it had on everybody, but
Mhm.
they may not have thought about the impact specifically on marketing agencies
Mm.
and what the agencies have had to do over the past 3 or 4 years to survive and come out in 2024 and actually be in a space where now they can grow their agency. I had a really powerful conversation with Tyler Anderson, who founded Casual Fridays in the hospitality industry. So his the bulk of his portfolio of clients were hotels.
Hmm.
So they all shut down in the pandemic.
Right.
And I can't even fathom what I would do if all of my clients went out of business. If I'm an
Yeah.
agency owner, how do I keep my agency going in that time? How do I avoid laying off everybody? And now how am I come out on the other end? And it's an interesting conversation because it's not as though 2024 is 2019. It's not as though this year everything has gone back to the way it was before the pandemic as if it never happened. No, things have
It's
changed,
different.
and things changed in a lot of ways that we don't know. So all that's to say, what I'm looking at people to have on the show, I want to have people obviously where it makes sense to develop a relationship with them,
Mhm.
but also still find a really interesting and creative angle or topic to talk about that's going to create some really valuable learnings in content that we can use in other ways.
Yeah. I love that. And I think too, like you said, it's you may want them as a client, but you may also want who they work with as clients. So it's just kind of not thinking so linear in
Mhm.
regards to like who you have as a guest. Um Now I don't know how to quite phrase this, but like what should we be thinking like in the back of our minds, or like how do we plan the conversation that we're going to have with the person on our show? Is there a right and a wrong way to engage in the conversation so that you can kind of convert them, if you will, from a podcast guest to then a potential partner or client?
All right, so Lindsay, you want the secret sauce? Okay, so
Of course I do. Give me the
I've got two
goods.
answers for you. The first high level structural answer is that I always go into the conversations I prepare a pre-show document because I'm thinking about, okay, who is it that I'm talking to? I ask them up front, in fact, what do they want to talk about? What could they talk about for fun for 30 minutes? Or with some of these newer podcasts, I specifically ask them, what has been some of the greatest challenges or challenge you've faced and overcome?
Yeah.
Because that's what I really want the show to be about. So I take all that and I build a topic for the show, and I build a series of questions, typically 8 questions, where I know by the end of those questions, we have built up to the point where they will have then shared their story and shared how they overcome their challenges or whatever it is that we're talking about, right? But I also have several questions that I ask every single guest. And so this is the second part of the answer. Because, first of all, when you've got consistent, almost stock questions that you ask guests, first of all, that makes your job as a host a lot easier.
True.
I don't have to come up with 8 questions. I only need to come up with like 5 questions because I've got 3 questions that I'm almost always going to ask. In my case, there are things like, what kinds of tools are you using in your marketing technology stack? We love to talk about tools. Marketers love to talk
Mm-hmm.
about tools. So we talk about things like that. But then in those questions, there's a magic question. There's a question where I'm not concerned so much with how they answer, but I want to know that they answered this question. I want to broach this topic, whatever it is, with this guest so that I can talk about it after the show.
Mm.
Because if you put yourselves, everyone listen, put yourself in the host perspective for a second. You're sitting there, you're running the show, you're asking these questions, and the guest is responding. But if you flip the table and think about yourself from the guest perspective, this may be the first time they've ever been on a podcast. Maybe the second or third time. Maybe they're an old pro. But if they're relatively new to being interviewed, they're nervous.
Yeah.
Regardless of, they're introverted, extroverted, they're probably nervous to some extent. And so they're doing their best during the show to answer your questions as best you can. And I always give them the option of looking at the questions ahead of time. I don't want to
Take them off
jar
guard.
anybody or, I don't want that, that gotcha moment. That's not my style. But then after the show, imagine you've hit end recording, you faded out, whatever you do to end your show. They're relieved. I mean, they were probably, I've had guests, they were literally sweating on the show. They're now relieved.
Aw.
And you, as the host, you come back on, you're like, Lindsay, you were fantastic. That was so good. You did such a great job. And they're like, really? Are you sure? Was that good for you? And you're like, yeah, no, that was fantastic. But remember when we were talking about this topic back there, and I asked you about this question? I thought that was really interesting what you said. Did you know that our business actually helps people who are going through those kinds of struggles and challenges, whatever it was that was in that topic? Is that something you might be interested in learning more about? And then you shut up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we need to put our sales hat on for just a moment. You need to ask that question. It's a super, super soft CTA, but you need to ask that question and shut up and let them think about what you just asked them and come up with a response. So I'll give you my example. At Agorapulse, we're a social media management solution. We work with large businesses and marketing agencies. And one of the things that we've developed over the past year and a half is a proprietary technology that helps people measure their actual ROI from every single individual social media post. If they're sharing a link, we track it, we integrate with Google Analytics, and so we can show you how many clicks that tweet or that Facebook post drove and what happened next. It's not just a bucket of, here's all the traffic we got from Facebook and it made a little bit of money. No. We'll tell you this post made $1,000 compared to these other posts that didn't make anything. And now that campaign really did something for you. And so we're able to give our users this really valuable report that shows this is our actual ROI from social media, not just all social media, but our own social media. These are the campaigns that we drove. So I asked people on air, how are you currently measuring the business impact of social media? And I'll let them answer it however they want. Most of them talk about, we try to get a lot of likes and reach and engagement, and it's very superficial stuff. And I don't call them on that. I'll let them answer however they want to. But then after the show, remember I said, this is fantastic. You did a great job. But remember when I asked you how you're measuring that impact, right? Wouldn't it be cool if you could see the actual dollar value of the content that you're putting out on social media? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to show your boss or your clients, if it's an agency, how much actual revenue you're driving through your campaigns for them? And of course, they're going to say yes.
Well, yeah.
Who wouldn't want to know that, right?
Right.
And so I said, if you're interested, I'd love to have my team get in touch with you and set up a demo, and they can show you more detail. I mean, obviously not now. We just got through this thing,
Yeah.
and you want to go on with your life, but we can set aside 30 minutes next week and show it to you.
Like, how easy is that? And it doesn't feel icky. It doesn't feel like you're going into a big sales spiel. You just like opened the door for yourself to create that opportunity.
Yeah. And so that's something I'm literally tracking. How many actual demo requests did I generate
Ooh.
out of the podcast interviews? And it's a hard metric because, like I said from the outset, not every single guest that I bring on the show am I trying to have that kind of relationship with.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I bring on just experts, right? I mean, I brought on a guy who, the guy who was talking about partnerships within agencies and the struggles that we might be dealing with if we've got multiple partners in an agency. He's a consultant, so I'm not trying to sell him
Mm-hmm.
on Agorapulse, but other agency owners, yeah, I want them to check out our tool. So the other really interesting technique that I use is, a lot of podcasts have mid-roll ads,
Yeah.
and a lot of podcasts, most podcasts, insert those after the fact. I insert mine live during the conversation. So I have a series of videos. These are 30 to 60 to 120 minute or 120 second videos that my video team has created. They're super nice videos. Usually they're testimonials from an agency or a retail social media manager or a hospitality social media manager. And I'll decide in advance what I want to play during that particular interview, thinking about the guest
Yeah.
and the topic, because I try to relate them if I can. And I will plan that. So 4 questions into the interview, out of an 8-question interview, I'll segue to this video and I'll play that video. And guess what? If you're on a video call with me, you're going to watch the video that I'm playing in front of you.
Exactly.
So the guests watch a 60-second ad for Agorapulse in the middle of the interview. They could walk away, but they don't know how long these, even though I usually
No.
tell them, these are not long videos, so they're not going to go anywhere. Maybe they'll have a drink of water or something, but I watched them. I use StreamYard and I'm seeing them engage with the videos. And for a while I thought, this is silly. Nobody's paying attention to that. But then one time, this was actually during a live show that I was doing, and I had a guest on, and we were asking deep questions, and played this video. And after the video, I always transition to the next question. I don't say anything about the video once
Yeah.
it's done. But I'm moving on to the next question, and the guest says, wait. Can we talk about what we just watched? I
Oh my
want to check that
God.
out.
That's
So we had to
awesome.
go back and talk about, the feature or whatever it was that we had just seen somebody talk about in a video testimonial
Yeah.
kind of a thing, and then get back on track with the regular questions. So it
That's
works. They're
cool.
watching.
Yeah. That's so smart. I love that. Now I also heard you say in an interview that you had that you liked seasons or series versus weekly. Do you still have that opinion? And if so, why?
Generally, yes. And I would say, particularly for the corporate shows that I'm creating, the Agorapulse
Right.
presented shows, I like having a seasonal approach. Now, these are still weekly shows. I still believe very strongly if you want to be
Right. Oh,
successful
agreed.
podcasts or live videos or anything like that, as much as I personally balk at it, I don't like having that kind of forced schedule. There's something about it. There's something about that that intangibleness that people can rely on. This content's going to come out, even though they're not necessarily looking for it. I mean, I don't have that. I don't have people asking me, when's my newsletter or when's my podcast coming out. Still, it's a little bit reassuring, and I think it's a little easier to get them to look at it
Mm-hmm.
if it's coming on a regular basis and they're used to it. So I do that no matter what. But I like having a seasonal approach from a corporate piece of content perspective because it gives me a very natural moment in time to stop and reevaluate.
Mm-hmm.
How has the past season gone? What changes do we need to make for the next season? Do we even continue for another season? And I really treat it like I'm a Netflix showrunner, a Disney Plus showrunner. Like, okay, am I going to renew this show for
Mm.
another season? And I'll be very transparent here. That's where I'm at with the Martech show. This
Yeah.
is a show that I started in Q1, and I had the idea in Q1. So it started a little bit later into Q1. So there were like 7 episodes in Q1. This is a weekly webinar show. And in Q1, it was creating a massive amount of work to put out this webinar. And that's because I hadn't really looked at how we were doing webinars in the past at Repurpose. That hadn't been my job. And when we started doing this show, I discovered we weren't doing webinars well logistically. There were just too many moving parts that had to go into how we were doing webinars
Mm-hmm.
before. So from the transition of season 1 to season 2, I said, well, I'm blowing up how we do webinars. We're starting from scratch. We're going to get a different system and streamline this. We're not going to send 3 mails. We're going to send 1, and just all these different things to make it a much more seamless and less time consuming process to build that. So then we went into season 2, which was happened to be quarter 2, producing the Martech show. And certainly we had less time put into it, but it still wasn't seeing the results that I wanted as a webinar. So now going into Q3, season 3 for the Martech show, I'm transitioning it to a live stream first, not a webinar first. So it's going to be ungated. It's going to go straight to our social media channels. It's also going to do every other week. So I'm kind of pushing back a little bit on what I said a moment ago. But with this particular show, it's not just guests, it's brand partners that I'm bringing on. So unlike most podcasts where it's nice if the guest shares the content after the fact, but it's not required. For what I'm doing, it's required. I am not bringing Adobe Express or TikTok on my show just for my fun. They're expected to
Yeah.
share the show in advance also.
Right.
And that was one of the big struggles I was hitting in Q1 and Q2, where a lot of the partners I was bringing on, they just weren't delivering the shares, they weren't delivering the reach and the signups that we needed to make this a worthwhile project. So that's a big reason why I like the seasonal thing. It gives me that
Yeah.
built-in time to think about it. Now, and I say all that with my AI podcast, the personal one, this is something I actually been thinking about because I'm in technically season 1, episode 6 at the time you and I are recording this particular episode. I don't know if I'll do a season 2. I'll probably just keep going and just do episode 7
Yeah.
and 8 and 9 and just ignore the fact that it's quote unquote season 1. I don't know that that's important. I
Yeah.
do think that a lot of podcasters put too much public facing emphasis on their podcast numbers, on their episode numbers. Like they start the episode title with this is episode 203
Yeah.
of the blah, 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 blah. Generally speaking, people don't care. And that's just getting in the way of conveying the value. So I'm de
Yeah.
emphasizing that too.
I like that too. Like focus on the topic or who is on it or what's the benefit for the listener versus like the episode number. I mean, I'm all for, when it's episode 100, 300, it's like woo. But
Right.
yeah, I know the episode number debate.
But I'm treating them like podcasts, right? So, like to your point, my most recent one with Claudia Sandino on the AI podcast, I published the title of the podcast. It's the same as the blog post. It conveys the value. We're talking
Yeah.
about how AI is transforming social media marketing with Claudia Sandino. That's all anybody needs to know to pique their interest or
Mhm.
not. They're not going to care if it's episode 6 or
No,
28. They don't, none of that matters.
no, agreed. Um, Now going back to that relationship, when you have a guest on your show, um, that you were wanting to partner with in some way or have as a client, do you have a certain way that you ask for referrals? Like, who do you know that would also like to be on the show? Like, because that can feel kind of awkward sometimes.
It definitely can feel awkward sometimes. So I would say to those of you listening, give yourself permission to not ask that question if it doesn't feel right in the
Mm,
moment. That's what I've had to teach myself, at least, that it's not
yeah.
always going to feel appropriate or comfortable to ask that in that green room post show environment. So you've got a couple options. You can just move on,
Yeah.
or like I was talking about before, I want to make sure that after every single episode, I'm sending them an email once it's published that has a link to the blog post, the podcast. I ask them to rate and review the podcast. I don't necessarily ask them to share it, but I do give them a link to a Google Drive folder that has all the assets that they can
Absolutely.
share if they want to. Now, in that email would be a perfect place to ask for, is there anybody else that you know that could be a good guest on the show? And I'll tell you, I just have a Google doc template that I copy and paste into an email, and I insert their links and I insert their name and anything else that I might want to say. But it's basically the same email that I'm sending, because again, I'm doing this 6 times a week. So
Totally.
I got to keep this very streamlined,
Ooh, you'd
right?
have to.
So I'm copying and pasting, I'm putting that template in there, and I don't actually do this. I probably could, but I could certainly have that question in there. Hey, is there anybody else that you could have on there? But in my pre-show document, in my run of show document, which is the one that I see for each of these interviews, it's got all my questions, everything that I'm going to say, my cues for the video, all that's in there. It's all documented. And at the very end, I do have questions to ask my guests. And I remember, for me, the number one question is, if it's a prospect, would you like a demo? And I come up with a way to, couch that around their answer and that sort of thing. So that's the other reason why I may not ask if there's anybody else that they might want to have on the show. Because if we've already had a really good conversation about the demo, I got what I wanted.
Right? Totally.
I don't need their help
Choose
finding
your
people
battles
to be on the show. Yeah.
Absolutely. But it is a good point that, like, if people hang out with people that are similar. So I imagine they would know other agency owners or know other social media managers or whatever that may be, that would, be a right fit for you as well. So, but like you said, do it when it feels right and doesn't feel weird. And yeah, you don't want to ask too many questions.
Yeah. Now I will say, the more often you do it, the more comfortable it'll feel, because
Yeah,
a lot of the uncomfortableness is the story we're telling
I
ourselves
know.
in our mind, So as you're going into this, if this is, early in your podcasting career, practice, and just practice talking to yourself. That will feel awkward too, but at least you won't have the embarrassment of practicing in front of
I
somebody
know.
else.
Very
It
true.
might help.
Now you touched upon this briefly, but I just kind of want to give it its own space. You mentioned that you use the content differently when you repurpose it,
Hmm.
when you're doing the zero listen podcast strategy versus the audience. I know you mentioned like about ads and targeting. Can you kind of expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so a lot of the repurposing that we're doing with the content is the same as virtually everybody else, right? We're
Okay.
taking the podcast, we're creating a blog post. It's either a summary of the podcast and then the transcript, or it's an edited version of the transcript that's been cleaned up and it reads like a movie script kind of a thing. Just depends on the show,
Yeah.
because the latter is what my content editor does. She takes the transcript and cleans it up and makes it really nice and easy to read. Which is great. Not everybody wants to spend that much time on a blog post of a podcast, but we do the same things everybody else does. We create the video snippets. We're creating the vertical video and the landscape and so on. So we're doing all those things. But the thing that we're doing with those, that's what's different, right? We're taking those assets and we're using them to get in front of all the other prospects that are within that target audience that we want to get in front of. So that means paid ads for sure, primarily
Yeah.
LinkedIn. We're going to
Oh,
test Instagram Reels and TikTok Reels, because we've got the vertical content, and some of the snippets are really, really interesting and compelling.
yeah.
So we're going to test all those. We may be testing vertical video on LinkedIn soon. Who knows? There's some interesting things going on with vertical video on LinkedIn. But that's our number one platform for reaching our audience. It's expensive,
Yeah.
but it's also the most effective. If you want to
Mm,
target marketing agency owners,
yeah.
that's the only platform you can target
Right.
that specific audience. But then the other thing that we're doing is we're handing all these assets over to our sales team. So for now, it's a Google Sheet that lists all the episodes, what the topic was, who the guests
Ah,
were, links to the blog posts, and there's columns for every piece of derivative content that we've created: vertical snippets, landscape snippets, quote graphics, all that, with a little text that says what this is.
yeah.
Okay, here's Megan Bowen from her agency talking about what it's like to take over from the former founder and CEO, linked to the actual snippet. So if a sales rep is in a conversation with a prospect and they recognize that they're going through something similar that we've already
Yeah.
talked about, right? They can send them the video snippet and say, if this really resonates with you, here's a link to the full
Totally.
blog post or podcast. And I say we're using a Google Sheet for now because I envision within the next 6 to 12 months, we'll probably have our own AI solution where they can just talk to the
Cool.
AI and say, look, do we have any assets about an agency that is looking to exit? And the AI will say, yeah, we've got these 3 episodes,
Yeah, yeah.
and here are the links. Whereas right now it's still very cumbersome for me to put that stuff in there, and for the
Yeah.
AEs and the SDRs and so on the sales team to know somehow that this exists. And it's soon going to get to the point where they're not going to have that capability, and it's going to be so much more efficient for them to simply be able to
Very.
query. Here's who I'm talking to. Here's the situation they're in. They've talked about this on LinkedIn. What do we have that's relatable?
And I love that. I wish more people on LinkedIn use that approach, like using their content, using their resources as a way to serve and help. And it's just like getting that little foot in the door without being salesy. Um,
Yeah,
it's
yeah. It's hard
way
because
better.
um, it's not scalable, right? From the individual perspective, right? It's time consuming work. And so it's not
Correct.
the kind of thing that you would do, again, to go back to that early example of,
Yeah.
someone who's buying a $20 widget of some kind. That's not what you would be doing. You're talking about mid-market to enterprise sales targets. That's who you want to spend some time with, knowing
Hmm.
that you're going to do this for 10 different people, and maybe only 2 of them will ever matriculate into the point where they're actually going to become a client. But they're going to be a 5,000 MRR a month,
Yeah.
and that's fine. Now you are totally, justified in not making the other 8, because that's fine. Now you
Yeah.
never know; some of those might turn out to be prospects in a year or 2
Down
from
the
now.
road.
Because again, when we're talking about mid-market enterprise, particularly in SaaS sales, like we are at Agorapulse, first of all, we have super long buying cycles. And second of all, us included, all of our competitors, we're all looking for, multi-year contracts. So someone I talked to today might be using a competitor, and they might be stuck in a 2-year contract, which means in 2 years from now,
True.
if I've made a good impression today, they'll be interested in coming back, which is actually one of my guests on the podcast. We did the whole
Sweet.
show. I didn't know what he was using. We did the whole show. This was for our hospitality podcast, which hasn't released yet. But this is for a very, very well-known hotel mega chain casino thing in Las Vegas. So everybody will recognize this brand. And we got to the end of the show, and I asked him the follow-up question. You were talking about measuring social media. Would you be interested in taking a look? And he says, well, we're in a 2-year contract with XYZ,
Hmm.
but would love to take a look at you guys when
Hmm.
it comes time to actually explore renewing that contract or going with somebody else.
Yeah. And it pays to start and nurture those relationships. It's not a quick transaction.
Right. Because the other key thing here, this is super subtle, but the other key thing is that each one of my podcast guests, it starts with a LinkedIn connection request, which they have to accept to continue the conversation, which means I'm now connected with them.
Yeah.
This individual that I'm talking about, he and I are connected on LinkedIn, and will continue to be connected for years, so I'll continue to stay top of mind
For
for
sure.
them.
Exactly. That's the whole point. Yeah, it's such a great strategy. And I do want podcasters to see that there is more than one path that they can take to gain ROI from podcasting, no matter what side of the mic that they are on. Because it can be super frustrating when you are going down one path and you're not getting the ROI that you want out of it, and you feel slightly disillusioned, that there are other ways that you can pivot and change to kind of, get more out of it. I love
Yeah,
it.
for sure.
So obviously you work with Agorapulse and you have your social media hat company. So where can people find more information and connect with you?
Yeah, so the easiest place is my website, thesocialmediahat.com. That's where you're going to be able to see the content that I published recently. I'm publishing blog posts every single week. I'm publishing a podcast on AI and marketing every single week. And you can find any of my social channels there. The icons are all over the site. So if there's a particular channel that you want to connect with me on and ask me questions, please feel free.
Perfect. Yeah, I can attest. I get your emails and it's like a wealth of information. It got my attention. And that's why I was like, I need to have you back.
I'm glad you do.
Yeah, so great to reconnect. And I so appreciate you sharing your experience with, gosh, 6 podcasts and how you can get more ROI from it. So I love the approach. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me here.
All right, folks, that is a wrap. And we'll see you next week on the Leverage Your Podcast Show.